After a devastating nuclear war, the entire Earth has turned into a wasteland. The lucky survivors are forced to gather in an isolated city. They try to survive amid fear and despair. When they gradually believe that human civilization will soon be wiped out, a ray of hope suddenly appears. Some people infected with nuclear radiation suddenly possess abnormal abilities. With just a wave of their hands, they can control the matter and energy around them. It is clear that humans have begun to change, but not everyone has evolved in a positive direction. Most of humanity, under the influence of prolonged radiation, has mutated into half-human, half-demon creatures and no longer retains their human form. They gather on the outskirts of the city and become cursed monsters that the survivors call the Lost. From then on, the abandoned wasteland is called the Lost Land. It has become a symbol of decline and horror. Time has passed in a flash. A century has passed. After 100 years of hard work to rebuild and survive, the survivors have built a new empire on the ruins. It was thought that this would be the dawn of a resurrected civilization, but no one expected that the birth of this empire would not bring hope, but instead bind humanity with heavier chains than ever. People had to work hard every day to survive in a world where the twilight of the apocalypse still loomed. That effort was only rewarded with a meager reward, just enough to barely survive. What was more frightening was that because of conflicts of interest and differences in beliefs, a deep rift had quietly formed between the empire and the church, a rift that would become increasingly difficult to heal over time. The church, in the name of reclaiming the lost lands, has been frantically recruiting civilians and secretly building an army within the city. Anyone with magical abilities is branded a heretic. Once discovered, they will be mercilessly hunted down by church warriors. This plunges the entire city into the darkness of a period of white terror. By the time those in power in the empire realize the danger, the church's power has grown so powerful that it is out of control. A storm that could change the entire new world is quietly approaching. Grey, the last surviving witch after the apocalypse, is said to have been born in the Lost Lands, a place that holds many mysteries. Countless people desire her power, but at the same time, they are afraid of the power she possesses. On a dark night, the Empress personally comes to Grey and proposes a secret deal. It turns out that the Emperor is seriously ill and could die at any moment. Once the head of the empire dies, the church will certainly take the opportunity to rebel and ignite a full-scale war to turn around the increasingly dire situation. The Queen decided to hire Grey to carry out a dangerous mission, which is to infiltrate the Lost Lands to track down a mutant werewolf with the ability to transform. According to rumors, if the blood of this creature is injected into a human body, the injected person will possess all the powers of a werewolf. In return, the Queen gave Grey a large bag of gold as a reward. The Queen promised that if Grey could bring back the werewolf blood, the Empire would guarantee her absolute safety. She would no longer be a target of the church's pursuit. With such an attractive promise and generous reward, Grey had no reason to refuse. She immediately agreed and swore that before the full moon night came, she would find the magical shapeshifter and take the power and then transfer it to the Queen. The Queen heard the promise and left with satisfaction. Immediately after that, Grey prepared to use her prophetic power to track the werewolf. But at that moment, the royal guard Gerace suddenly appeared and used his power to interrupt Grey's magic. Gerace implied that the werewolf's power absolutely could not fall into the Queen's hands, or the consequences would be an unimaginable disaster. He did not hesitate to take out his family heirloom, a gold pocket watch, as a reward. His purpose was to stop this crazy transaction. Grey immediately recognized the jealousy hidden in Gerace's eyes, but the gold watch made it impossible for Grey to refuse. It turned out that as long as the reward was attractive enough, Grey would agree to any request. That was the nature of a witch who always knew how to weigh the benefits. After Gerace left, Grey once again used her precognitive powers to search for the whereabouts of the werewolf. The images that appeared in her mind were of a group of adventurers struggling to cross a dry riverbed covered with bones. The air was filled with the smell of death. Their destination was a deep cave hidden in the darkness. Suddenly, a pair of red eyes flashed in the darkness. It was the mutant werewolf, the target that Grey was searching for. However, the murderous aura emanating from that creature far exceeded her expectations. Grey understood that she was absolutely no match for that monster based on her own strength. In order to increase the chances of success for the mission, Grey decided to risk infiltrating the dangerous underground black market. In a hidden tavern deep in the market, Grey found a man named Boyce, a legendary bounty hunter that people had been talking about. Boyce had set foot in the Lost Lands many times and had extensive combat experience. He was clearly the ideal candidate for the role of God. However, when Grey revealed the purpose of this trip, Boyce's eyes flashed with hesitation. After a moment of hesitation, he admitted that there was indeed a mutant werewolf named Sodor near the Skull River area. But that place was filled with corpses. Regardless regardless of whether they were survivors of lost souls. Once they set foot there, they could not return. Gray could not help but shiver in horror when she heard this, but she quickly realized that this was most likely the place mentioned in the prophecy. After a moment of contemplation, Gray took out the pocket watch that Jerry's had given her. In the ruined and chaotic post-apocalyptic world, an item that could record time was extremely valuable. Boyce saw the item and agreed to accompany Gray without hesitation. However, as soon as he finished speaking, a group of strangers with fierce faces suddenly burst into the tavern. It turned out that the church had tracked down and sent people to eliminate Gray, whom they considered a heretic. But they had underestimated the abilities of Gray and Boyce. In just a second, Gray and Boyce disappeared completely, leaving no trace except for a coin spinning on the table. It was like proof that everything that had just happened was true. Realizing that target had escaped, Enforcer, who was in charge of this mission, was angry and disappointed. What scared Enforcer the most was the wrath of the High Priest when he knew that the mission had failed. She knew very well that she would not be able to escape punishment. But at that moment, shocking news from an insider in the inner palace was transmitted. It turned out that last night, the Queen had secretly met with Gray and even assigned Gray the task of finding a treasure in the Lost Lands. Without hesitation, the High Priest immediately rang the bell to summon the believers and mobilize all the forces he could mobilize. He personally appointed Enforcer as the commander of the campaign. He ordered her to immediately march into the Lost Lands and track down Gray at all costs. At the same time, after escaping the pursuit of the church, Gray and Boyce set out and arrived at a remote border town called Fengsha-Jen. This place was not very famous, but an old friend of Gray's named Rose was living there. Rose helped them find a safe haven to rest and recover. Boyce was busy everywhere collecting all kinds of necessities to carefully prepare for the journey into the Skull River area, with Rose's full support. Time passed so urgently that it was visible to the naked eye. At this time, Gray was haunted by a prophecy in her head. If they followed the usual route, there was a high chance that they would encounter an accident or be stopped by an out-of-control stray. If that happened, they would not be able to reach the necessary location before the full moon. Once the full moon rose, the werewolf's power would increase exponentially. At that time, even if Gray and Boyce joined forces, they would not be able to resist. However, if they missed this opportunity, they would have to wait another long year, and no one could predict what would happen to the world during that time. Just as Gray was worried, Boyce came up with a bold plan. He remembered that there was a small road that was little known. It ran along the abandoned railway from the period before the collapse of human civilization. If they followed this road, they could shorten their journey by 3 days. However, it also posed numerous dangers, with a high possibility of being ambushed by lost people. However, Gray did not hesitate and immediately agreed to Boyce's plan. The next morning, they carried their heavy luggage and entered the Lost Lands together, a desolate land covered in deathly silence and decay. Throughout the journey, they were surrounded by scenes of destruction and desolation. The once bustling skyscrapers were now just collapsed ruins. The ground was full of giant cracks like the mouths of bloodthirsty monsters. It seemed to lead straight into an endless abyss. From Boyce's story, Gray knew that this place was once one of the most glorious cities of mankind. But the Great War that destroyed the world had erased everything. Dozens of nuclear warheads feel like scythes of death and turned the city into ashes in an instant. Their destination this time was the Skull River, hidden deep within those terrifying cracks. It was indeed a difficult task to reach safety at the right time. Not long after they left, the Enforcer also led soldiers to control a train that was speeding towards the direction Gray and Boyce were heading. When the Queen knew that the church had arbitrarily sent the Enforcers away from the capital, she was immediately enraged and rushed straight to the High Priest to ask him. But the High Priest calmly replied that Gray had previously murdered a church member, so she had committed an unforgivable crime. They were only carrying out a mission to capture a heretic. Of course, the Queen understood the hidden meaning behind these words. However, she still remained calm and maintained the demeanor of someone holding supreme power in response. She said that the Emperor was currently seriously ill and could not manage the situation, while the people's insecurity was growing. If the church mobilized its forces so massively at this time, it would be like pushing the Empire into a two-way attack. However, the High Priest not only did not yield, but also responded in a firm tone, saying that all the rumors were just fabrications. He even coldly advised the Queen that instead of worrying about the church's affairs, she should focus on appeasing the people. If she couldn't do that, she should give up power to someone more worthy. Obviously, he no longer respected the Queen. On the other side, the Enforcers and their troops had reached Fengsha-Jen. They quickly ordered brutal torture to force Rose to reveal the whereabouts and purpose of Gray and Boyce's trip. Rose's sister Mara, unable to bear the sight of her brother being tortured, choked up and confessed everything in tears. However, she could not foresee the the Enforcer's cold brutality. As soon as she got the necessary information, Enforcer immediately ordered the burning of the entire town of Fengshajian. Then she led the soldiers to continue the pursuit towards Skull River. At this time, there were only 3 days left until the full moon. Boyce led Gray to an abandoned forest station where there was a ferryman named Saris. For a price of 1 gold coin, Saris would take them across the abyss by cable car. But when they arrived at the camp, they found Saris murdered in the middle of the station. Boyce guessed that Saris was ambushed and murdered by other survivors, so he immediately ran to check if cable car system was still working. But at that moment, there were hurried footsteps from behind them. A second later, Enforcer and a group of soldiers surrounded the entire camp. The church even kidnapped Mara, Rose's sister, to force Boyce to give up the deal with Gray. But when it comes to wealth, people can become extremely cold. Although his best friend was in despair because his sister was captured, Boyce still had no intention of breaking the deal with Gray. Realizing that the negotiation had failed, Enforcer immediately flew into a rage and shot Mara dead right before their eyes. Boyce screamed in anger and immediately drew his weapon and rushed into a life-and-death battle with the enemy. Gray also slipped into the fight. A great battle broke out right there. Although Gray and Boyce both had excellent fighting skills, they were still no match for the large numbers. They soon fell into a disadvantageous position and were forced to fight and retreat. In a desperate moment, they quickly jumped onto the cable car and hoped to escape to the other side of the ravine. However, a group of desperate believers jumped onto the cable, determined to stop the escape. Seeing that the target was in danger of escaping, the Enforcer immediately ordered the cable to be cut, determined to bury Gray and Boyce alive in the abyss. The cable car lost traction and fell straight down. But at that moment, the anti-fall system that Saris had set up in advance activated. It helps the cable to be held in suspension by the second rope attached to the other end. Seeing the dangerous situation, Gray immediately climbed out of the cabin and started to follow the cliff to find a way to climb up. Boyce quickly reacted and followed her. But Enforcer on the other side absolutely did not let them escape easily. She hurriedly picked up the sniper rifle and fired a bullet that hit Boyce, almost causing him to fall off cliff. Just as Enforcer was about to shoot Gray, her eyes accidentally met Gray's. At that moment, Enforcer's consciousness fell into chaos. Her whole body was stiff and she could not move. When Enforcer woke up, there was only an empty space on the cliff. Gray and Boyce had completely disappeared. The anger that surged up made her go crazy. She immediately ordered the soldiers to find a way to cross the ravine to continue the pursuit. Not long after, Gray and Boyce stopped to rest in a ruined area. Boyce tried to endure the pain to treat the bullet wound in his arm, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the coldness in his heart. He silently looked towards the lonely windmills spinning silently in the middle of nowhere. Boyce felt like he was no different from a homeless wanderer in this ruined world, and perhaps that ruined place would be the final resting place of his life. Gray beside him also silently looked into the distance. Her eyes reflected loneliness and helplessness. After a short break, Gray and Boyce continued their search for the werewolf. However, as they passed through an area full of collapsed walls, the sound of a train engine suddenly roared from behind. The sound was getting closer and closer, like the drums of death urging them. They immediately turned around and saw an iron train bearing the symbol of the church rushing towards them. Realizing the dire situation, Gray and Boyce quickly hid in the ruins of a nuclear power plant. They held their breath and waited for the train to pass. Fortunately, the church did not detect them, but this hiding cost them a lot of precious time. There were less than 2 days left until the full moon. On the mountain range they were crossing, bloodthirsty wanderers were scattered everywhere. For safety reasons, they decided not to travel at night, but to find a safe place to spend the night. However, from deep within the ruins, a terrifying roar suddenly rang out, sending a chill down Gray and Boyce's spines. Boyce's face immediately paled as he realized that there was a high possibility that they were surrounded by wanderers. In the moment of death, Gray suddenly had a bold idea. She quickly knocked over a barrel of gasoline that was prepared to be used as a fire. The next moment, the entire ruins were suddenly lit up by a fierce fire. With instinctive reflexes, Gray and Boyce immediately drew their weapons to defend themselves. From the darkness, a deformed and terrifying face appeared without any warning. A tall stray charged straight at them like a mad wild beast. Boyce quickly threw a lighter into the barrel of gasoline. In a flash, the flames flared up fiercely, forming a ring of fire around them. The strays saw this and immediately retreated. It was temporarily blocked by the wall of fire. But before Gray and Boyce could breathe a sigh of relief, another wave of strays appeared from the darkness. They all rushed forward, pushing a large steel plate straight into the ring of fire, creating a gap in the line of fire. It was unexpected that these monsters acted in an organized and strategic manner. When they broke through the ring of fire and rushed inside, Gray immediately launched a counterattack, knocking one of the monsters away. But clearly, that way of fighting back was like throwing salt into the sea. On top of the collapsed tower nearby, countless strays crowded together and stared down at them. And then, their leader suddenly jumped down, straight into the ring of fire, and knocked Gray to the ground. However, the unbelievable thing happened, that the monster seemed to recognize Gray, who was lying at its feet. He coldly warned her, "You shouldn't be here." But before she could finish, a strange light flashed in Gray's eyes. In just a split second, she cast a spell to lock the leader of the strays with her ability. Then Gray slowly extended her left hand. Immediately, the surrounding flames seemed to be controlled by an invisible force and rushed towards the leader of the monsters. In just a moment, all the lost people were burned to ashes in the ferocious fire. Boyce, who witnessed everything with his own eyes, could not help but be shocked. The power that Gray had just displayed was beyond all imagination. But because of that, a question arose in his mind. If she really possessed such terrifying power, why didn't she use it to overthrow the corrupt empire and build a new world? Unexpectedly, Gray calmly replied, "The destruction of the empire is inevitable, but now is not the time." She also did not forget to emphasize that anyone who craves power through the wrong means will eventually pay the price. And the leader of the lost people who had just been burned was the clearest proof. At the same time, in the royal palace, the pregnant queen suddenly launched a coup, just like the church had plotted to overthrow the royal family. Now she saw a golden opportunity when the entire army of the church was mobilized to the front line to hunt down Gray in the Lost Lands. In the quiet of the night, she strangled the dying emperor with her own hands, and she officially ascended the supreme throne. In a situation of force majeure, the high priest had no choice but to outwardly show his submission to the empress. But inwardly, he secretly ordered enforcers to quickly capture Gray at all costs and stop the growing power of the royal family. On the other side, Gray finally reached the Land of Fire, the last place before entering the Skull River, where the mutant werewolf was hiding. Gray did not want to implicate innocent people, so she handed over the pocket watch that had been discussed in advance to Boyce and signaled that he should leave alone. But after so many hardships and difficulties together, Boyce could not bear to let Gray go to the dead end alone. He advised her to return to the city with him. However, Boyce did not know that the so-called "when there is a request, it will be answered" was the curse that Gray carried on her. She was forced to fulfill every contract that she had sworn. Boyce had no choice but to continue accompanying her. Gray and Boyce crossed the ruins and entered a deep tunnel. At this point, they were only a short distance from Skull River. But at that moment, the rails under their feet suddenly shook violently. Gray immediately understood that the enforcer had caught up here. At this point, Gray could not let all her efforts go up in smoke. Gray told Boyce to hide while she stepped out. Gray stood tall on the rails, preparing to confront the pursuer head-on. When the enforcer saw Gray standing in front of the train, he immediately ordered to speed up. Her eyes revealed a crazy, murderous intent. But at that moment, Gray suddenly turned around and ran towards tunnel entrance. By the time enforcer realized something was wrong, it was too late. The track ahead had been cut off long ago. Gray jumped off the broken section. Immediately after, a loud explosion rang out. The train fell into the abyss and exploded into thousands of pieces. At the dangerous moment, Boyce was able to save Gray in time. Gray and Boyce both miraculously survived. After receiving the news that enforcer had died, the high priest was immediately furious. He decided to use force to take back power from the queen. However, no one expected Juris, the queen's loyal guard, to suddenly appear and destroy all of the high priest's subordinates. It turned out that he had been secretly acting on the queen's orders for a long time and quietly purged all the armed forces within the church. Immediately after that, Juris personally executed the high priest in the name of the royal family and completely consolidated the queen's position and power. From then on, she became the ultimate power in the empire. At the same time, Gray and Boyce crossed the dangerous canyon and arrived at the Skull River in time before the full moon appeared. The land was littered with white skeletons. All of them were the corpses of people who had been massacred by the mutant werewolves. Immediately after, Boyce tried to persuade Jerry's that they were absolutely no match for that monster, but Jerry's was completely unmoved. Jerry's pulled out a pure silver weapon that had been carefully prepared in advance. Seeing this, Boyce could not help but recall that many warriors had come here with silver weapons to challenge him, but they all died, and none of them returned. Obviously, silver had no effect on the mutant werewolves. However, Gray still did not give up. She carried a pair of sharp silver claws and stepped out into the heavy rain and stood tall under the cold moonlight. However, when the full moon rose high, the mutant werewolf still did not appear. Boyce stepped forward to persuade Gray to retreat once again, but Gray soon realized the lie in his eyes. It turned out that Boyce was the mutant werewolf that Gray had been searching for all this time. When his true identity was exposed, Boyce now was affected by the full moon, could no longer hide. A growl escaped from his throat as his body began to change right in front of Gray. But at that moment, Boyce felt a strange resistance rising from his arm, as if something was blocking the power that was surging within him. It turned out that Gray had seen that sign in the prophecy long ago. And when she had sewn up Boyce's wound earlier, she had secretly inserted a silver coin into his body and used it to control the werewolf's power. After stopping Boyce's transformation, Gray threw the pocket watch away and took the opportunity to use a magic trick. Boyce reflexively rushed to counterattack, but the moment Boyce's eyes met Gray, his mind immediately fell into a state of confusion. In that delusion, Gray's image transformed into a monstrous crane. Boyce roared angrily and rushed forward to grab the bird's wings with his claws, but Gray's silver claws stabbed straight into Boyce's stomach. A powerful energy blast exploded, knocking Boyce to the ground. Boyce tried to get up, but he realized that his body had completely lost control. When he opened his eyes again, his entire body was bound by cold iron chains. In desperation, Boyce begged Gray to spare his life. At the same time, Boyce tried to take advantage of the ask for help curse she carried to propose a trade. Hearing this, a trace of hesitation flashed across Gray's eyes. But at that moment, the dark clouds cleared, revealing the bright full moon shining on Boyce's face, which was gradually changing. He was once again preparing to transform into a werewolf. Gray immediately woke up. Without hesitation, she stabbed the silver dagger straight into Boyce's heart. A moment later, the sky began to brighten. Gray quietly buried Boyce's body, then carried the peeled wolf skin and galloped back to the Imperial City to complete the mission. When Gray passed by the place where the heretics were being held by the church for hard labor, they immediately raised their iron hose high, shouting in hope, praying that the powerful witch could overthrow the church and bring freedom to those with magic. Gray was silent, and her eyes were extremely complicated when she witnessed that scene. She tightly held the wolf skin and went straight to the palace to deliver the item. At the gate, Gray handed the torn skin back to Jerry's and sternly instructed, "The queen must wear this skin before 12 o'clock tonight. Otherwise, the transformation power hidden in that skin will completely disappear." However, Jerry suddenly questioned Gray about why she did not fulfill her promise to stop Queen. Unexpectedly, Gray calmly replied with a meaningful sentence, "I have cleared all obstacles between you and the Queen. Thus, our contract has been completely completed." Hearing this, Jerry's immediately understood everything. Then Jerry's quietly left without saying another word. When the Queen knew that the wolf skin that Gray brought back was Boyce's, her whole body was struck by lightning in a clear sky. It turned out that Boyce was the secret lover that was rumored in the harem, and also the father of the child growing in her womb. It turned out that the real reason why the Queen wanted to have the werewolf's power was because she wanted to escape this rotten world with Boyce and live a free life, free from the confinement of power and royal calculations. But ironically, fate dealt her the cruelest blow. In a moment of extreme pain, the Queen lost all reason and drew out her dagger and without hesitation stabbed Jerry's, who had always been loyal to her. Then, she collapsed on the wolf skin and cried out in pain, helpless and broken. At the same time, Gray led the oppressed people to break into the palace. Hearing the earth-shattering screams and the clash of metal, the Queen's expression immediately changed. She rushed out to check the situation, but the scene before her eyes left her speechless with horror. The people who had once endured now all picked up torches and weapons and launched a mad uprising. The nobles had no time to react or organize a defense, so they were swept away by the chaotic and bloody whirlwind. In the blazing fire, the palace turned into a living hell. The people who had been trampled upon awakened like wild beasts, demanding their right to live. It turned out that the reason Gray accepted the Queen's mission from the beginning was because she had seen the fate of the Empire in the prophecy. As long as Gray could deal with Boyce, this rotten empire would collapse. The people who had been exploited for generations would rise up to build a new world full of hope. The next morning, under the first rays of sunlight that illuminated the ruined land, Boyce's wolf skin turned into sparkling points of light that flew towards the Skull River, where the smell of death still lingered. Immediately after that, Boyce suddenly and miraculously came back to life, and the first thing he did after waking up was to immediately set out to find Gray to take revenge. However, when he met Boyce again, Gray did not avoid it. She calmly poured out the whole truth that she had never really intended to kill him. Taking the wolf skin was just a means to push the prophecy to come true, because the destruction of the Empire is a necessary stepping stone for a great change in this corrupt world. Hearing this, the hatred in Boyce's eyes gradually disappeared, replaced by understanding and sympathy. In the end, Boyce and Gray chose to shake hands and make peace. Then together they entered the mysterious land called the Lost Lands. Today's story ends here. Thank you for watching the film. If you find it interesting, please give me a like and subscribe to the channel to support us. Goodbye, and see you again.